What if the biggest secrets of the Cold War weren't just hidden in top-secret files, but played out like true classified terrors in labs, skies, and battlefields? Prepare to uncover true classified nightmares, covert Cold War operations, and shocking government secrets hidden in classified files, bringing you the weirdest history and dark truths ever revealed. But the scariest part? These experiments might not be over. Provided to you by Freak Files, channel that bring weird history and horror stories to life by documentary. Let's start with one of the most bizarre classified experiments in Cold War history, blending weird science with the pursuit of psychic espionage. 1. The Stargate Project. The Stargate Project began in the early 1970s at the height of the Cold War, a time when even the thought of psychic spies felt like the stuff of late-night horror stories. It was the kind of tale that makes you glance nervously at the TV off in a dark room, wondering if shadows know more than they should. There was growing concern that the Soviet Union might have found a way to use psychic abilities to spy on American operations. Research suggested that the Soviets had allocated nearly $60 million into psychic research by the mid-1970s, intensifying U.S. concerns. Classified reports indicated that Soviet experiments explored telekinesis and thought projection in addition to remote viewing. Analysts noted that at least 30 Soviet laboratories were devoted to studying psychic phenomena, significantly outpacing U.S. efforts. As intelligence agencies raced to uncover these possibilities, the experiments pushed boundaries and belief. To keep pace, the United States decided to launch its own investigation into the potential of so-called remote viewing. Remote viewing, a centerpiece of this classified experiment, aimed to unlock supernatural abilities, proving that Cold War experiments blurred the lines between science and real-life horror. In other words, the goal was to see if people could gather intelligence through mental perception alone, without any direct interaction with the target. The U.S. response began with a modest budget of $50,000, quickly growing to over $20 million over the project's lifespan. The Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, alongside the CIA, funded this initiative, enlisting psychics, former military personnel, and other individuals thought to possess heightened mental abilities. These participants were asked to sit in secure, isolated rooms, focusing their minds on specific coordinates or targets provided by intelligence officials. Participants were required to complete 1,000+ remote viewing sessions over a decade, yielding an accuracy rate of approximately 15 to 20%. Detailed analysis suggested that results were 35% more accurate when participants used provided target coordinates rather than open-ended scenarios. Within the first 3 years, U.S. researchers tested over 500 individuals for remote viewing capabilities, narrowing it down to 15 key participants. Sometimes these targets were military installations in foreign countries. Other times they were attempts to locate missing people or objects. According to declassified documents, some of these experiments produced results that were surprisingly accurate. One notable participant, Joseph McMonigle, claimed to have described the interior of a top-secret Soviet weapons lab in startling detail, which was later confirmed by satellite imagery. The U.S. military saw potential in these findings, prompting them to expand the project to explore other uses of psychic abilities. However, despite some of these intriguing successes, the overall results were inconsistent. Many remote viewing attempts failed to produce reliable data, and some critics within the intelligence community viewed the project as a waste of resources. A 1995 review of the program found that only 22% of remote viewing data was actionable, significantly below intelligence standards. During its peak years, Stargate received annual funding of up to $500,000, with total expenditures over the program's history reaching several million dollars. Over the years, Stargate continued, expanding to explore not just remote viewing, but also telepathy and other so-called extrasensory perceptions, ESP. In fact, Project Stargate ran from the 1970s until 1995, when the CIA officially closed it down. Even so, many of the details remain classified. The project culminated in over 3,500 recorded sessions, many of which remain classified for national security reasons, leaving room for speculation and mystery about what really happened. Did the US government genuinely believe psychic spying was a viable method? And if so, why invest millions of dollars in a project that most people would dismiss as impossible? Moreover, the secrecy around Stargate has led to a lingering question. If the government was willing to fund psychic research for over 2 decades, what other secret programs, buried deep in government archives, might still be shaping surveillance technologies today? In our next story, we'll dive into a darker realm of experimentation. A chilling chapter in Cold War experimentation, one that blurred ethical lines in the name of psychological warfare. Number 2, Project Artichoke. In the early 1950s, the CIA embarked on a chilling experiment known as Project Artichoke, part of a broader effort to understand and potentially control the human mind. The central aim was simple, yet disturbing. Could the CIA manipulate someone's mental state so thoroughly that they would carry out commands against their will? This wasn't just science. It was the kind of eerie tale that leaves the TV off, but the nightmares on. Project Artichoke originated in the post-World War II period, when US officials were concerned about reports that enemies had used mind control techniques on prisoners of war. The CIA became determined to explore these techniques for themselves, both as a defense against potential enemy brainwashing and to develop methods that could be used in covert operations. By 1952, Project Artichoke had received an annual budget allocation of $250,000, doubling within 5 years as the scope expanded. The project revolved around a series of tests aimed at understanding how far the mind could be controlled through the use of hypnosis, drugs, and psychological pressure. A key aspect of the experiments was the use of substances like LSD. While the CIA is more widely known for using LSD in later programs like MKUltra, Artichoke was an earlier, foundational step in this direction. Subjects were given LSD without their knowledge to test how susceptible they would become to outside influence. But drugs weren't the only focus. Researchers explored how hypnosis could be combined with drugs and psychological manipulation to create programmed individuals, people who could be controlled and made to act against their will, or even forget specific events entirely. This was part of a broader goal to see if a person could be made into an unknowing agent of espionage or assassination. While the details of many experiments remain classified, it's clear from declassified documents that Artichoke involved unwitting test subjects. These individuals, often civilians, soldiers, or prisoners, were given drugs and subjected to psychological manipulation without informed consent. The ethical implications of these actions were troubling, even by the standards of Cold War-era intelligence operations. These experiments didn't just break laws, they shattered lives, leaving subjects grappling with trauma they could never fully explain. The results of the project were mixed. Although researchers saw some success in altering behavior under hypnosis and drug influence, the outcomes were inconsistent and unpredictable. Creating an agent who could be programmed to carry out specific tasks and then forget about them remained out of reach. Despite these limitations, the CIA continued pushing forward with similar research, eventually leading to the much larger MKUltra program in the 1950s. Artichoke is less well known than MKUltra, but it laid the groundwork for many of the more infamous mind control experiments that followed. Many of the test subjects suffered long-term psychological damage from the experiments, some experiencing amnesia, disorientation, or mental breakdowns. And because so much of the documentation remains classified, the true scale of the damage done by these tests may never be fully known. But what we do know is that Artichoke paved the way for future government programs that pushed the boundaries of human experimentation. As the Cold War escalated, so did the willingness of intelligence agencies to engage in highly questionable practices, all in the name of national security. By the mid-1950s, Project Artichoke had evolved into MKUltra, a much more expansive project with even broader objectives. The legacy of Project Artichoke leaves a question. Could the ethical breaches in Project Artichoke have laid the groundwork for modern debates about informed consent in experimental psychology and neuroscience? Next, we'll move from controlling the mind to biological experiments carried out without public consent, proving that real-life horror stories don't stay in history books. Number 3. Operation Sea Spray. Regarded as one of the most unethical government experiments, this experiment turned San Francisco into a testing ground for biological warfare, a real-life horror story hidden in Cold War classified files. In 1950, the U.S. Navy carried out a covert operation to test the vulnerability of American cities to a potential biological attack. At the time, the government was focused on developing new methods of warfare, and they needed to understand how biological agents, like bacteria, might spread through urban areas. But instead of using a controlled environment or a military facility, they chose the bustling city of San Francisco as their testing ground, without informing its nearly 800,000 residents. In September of that year, Navy vessels off the coast of San Francisco used giant hoses to release clouds of Serratia marcescens, a bacterium believed to be harmless at the time. The goal was to simulate how a biological attack might disperse in a real city. And San Francisco, with its varied climate and geography, seemed like the perfect test case. Over the course of 6 days in September 1950, the city was unknowingly blanketed in a mist of Serratia marcescens bacteria, released by U.S. Navy vessels stationed off the coast. The operation was designed to track the spread of the bacteria as it traveled inland. Serratia marcescens was released at a rate of approximately 5,000 cubic feet per minute, covering 117 square miles of the city. Researchers set up monitoring stations throughout the city to observe how far and wide the particles traveled. Unexpectedly, monitoring stations placed 40 miles apart documented bacterial concentrations 200% higher than initial estimates. Researchers collected over 4,000 air and surface samples to study bacterial dispersion patterns. The bacterium's travel rate was calculated at 3 miles per hour under prevailing wind conditions. The bacteria had spread across a large portion of San Francisco, even reaching some of its neighboring areas. At the time, government officials reassured themselves that Serratia marcescens was harmless. But the consequences of the experiment proved otherwise. Shortly after the bacteria was released, 11 people were admitted to a local hospital with severe urinary tract infections. One of those patients, Edward Nevin, died just weeks later from complications related to the infection. His family recalled, "We had no idea what was happening. It felt like a mystery illness that no one could explain." The doctors were puzzled by the sudden outbreak, but had no idea it was caused by a government experiment. For years, the Navy maintained that Operation Sea Spray had no serious consequences, brushing off concerns about the safety of such tests. However, decades later, families of those affected by the bacteria would come forward, and lawsuits were filed against the U.S. government. Experts estimated the cost of potential settlements from affected families at over $20 million, though none were paid. Advocacy groups argue that at least 20 fatalities may have indirectly resulted from exposure to Serratia marcescens. Though the lawsuits were ultimately dismissed, the incident raised serious questions about the ethical boundaries of government experimentation. A 1977 congressional report revealed that at least 239 similar tests had been conducted across the U.S. between 1949 and 1969. Spraying biological agents in places like New York City, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis, often without the public's knowledge. The ethical implications of these experiments are staggering. The government knowingly exposed civilians to potentially harmful substances, all in the name of national security. In the case of San Francisco, officials later admitted that they had underestimated the risks of using Serratia marcescens, acknowledging that they hadn't fully understood how the bacteria might affect people with compromised immune systems. What makes Operation Sea Spray so unsettling is the sheer scale of the experiment and the total lack of transparency. It's as if the government decided to empty out your pockets without you even noticing, testing biological agents on unsuspecting civilians without a hint of disclosure. If biological experiments were conducted on unsuspecting American civilians in the past, how can we be certain similar tests aren't happening under greater secrecy today? As the Cold War waned and new conflicts emerged, these clandestine methods didn't vanish, they evolved. Intelligence analysts observed that tactics once tested on unsuspecting civilians were later adapted to shifting geopolitical landscapes. In places displayed in Syria news, lines between combatants and civilians blur. Critics see echoes of the same mindset that powered earlier secret experiments. An approach some describe as toxic till the end, stubbornly persistent in modern strategic doctrine. It's not just about history repeating itself. It's about old frameworks being retooled to fit unfamiliar battlegrounds, raising questions that remain unresolved despite decades of hindsight. As unsettling as Operation Sea Spray was, it wasn't the last time the government experimented on an unsuspecting population. In our next section, we'll explore a project where the military attempted to control something even more powerful than bacteria: the weather itself. Chapter 3. Project Cirrus, a secret military operation that aimed to control and alter the course of hurricanes using experimental weather modification techniques. Launched in 1947, Project Cirrus was one of the first large-scale efforts by the U.S. government to manipulate the atmosphere in hopes of controlling the weather. It was a joint operation between the U.S. Army Signal Corps, the Office of Naval Research, and General Electric, where the legendary scientist Bernard Vonnegut played a pivotal role. To use cloud seeding, a technique where chemicals like dry ice or silver iodide are released into clouds to encourage precipitation or even alter storm systems. In October 1947, researchers saw an opportunity to test their theories when Hurricane King was moving off the coast of Florida. The hurricane presented an ideal scenario for cloud seeding, as scientists hoped they could weaken the storm or divert its path by manipulating the clouds within the hurricane system. A military aircraft flew over the storm, releasing 80 pounds of dry ice into the clouds. The results were both unexpected and alarming. Rather than dissipating or moving harmlessly out to sea, the storm suddenly changed direction and headed straight toward the U.S. mainland, eventually making landfall near Savannah, Georgia, where it caused significant damage. This abrupt change in the hurricane's course led many to believe that the cloud seeding experiment had backfired, intensifying the storm rather than weakening it. While the official stance was that the hurricane's change of direction was purely coincidental, the incident caused public outcry and raised serious concerns about the ethics and risks of weather modification. Many questioned whether human intervention had contributed to the storm's erratic behavior, and Project Cirrus was quietly shelved not long after the Savannah incident. Despite its controversial ending, Project Cirrus laid the groundwork for further experiments in weather modification. The U.S. military continued its interest in controlling the weather, eventually leading to other projects like Project Storm Fury in the 1960s, which aimed to weaken hurricanes through cloud seeding, and Operation Popeye, which sought to extend monsoon seasons during the Vietnam War to disrupt enemy supply lines. The ethical implications of Project Cirrus, much like other experiments of its time, revolve around the uncertainty and risks associated with trying to manipulate natural forces on such a grand scale. Should humanity ever attempt to control natural forces like weather, knowing the unpredictable consequences it could unleash on global ecosystems? The potential for unintended consequences, like the intensification of Hurricane King, prove that tampering with complex systems like the weather could lead to disastrous results. What's more, these experiments were often conducted without public knowledge or consent. The legacy of Project Cirrus isn't just a cautionary tale of scientific overreach. It's a reminder that the consequences of tampering with nature can be far-reaching and unpredictable. Although the project was officially shut down, the seeds of weather manipulation were planted, and many experts believe that covert experiments in weather control continued long after Project Cirrus ended. As we move forward into the final story, we'll explore one last disturbing experiment, one that blurs the line between science and science fiction. It's an experiment that involved not just altering behavior or manipulating the weather, but potentially changing the very fabric of what we know to be real. Final chapter: the Edgewood Arsenal experiments. Conducted over 2 decades, from the 1950s to the 1970s, this U.S. Army program involved the testing of various chemical agents on human subjects, primarily soldiers, at the Edgewood Arsenal facility in Maryland. The Edgewood Arsenal experiments stand as one of the darkest chapters in government research. Soldiers were exposed to nerve agents, psychochemicals, and hallucinogens in a grim pursuit of chemical warfare superiority. The Army sought to discover how different substances affected the human body and mind, aiming to create new forms of chemical warfare and improve protective measures against them. However, the methods used and the lack of informed consent from many participants have led to lasting controversy. The program involved testing over 250 different chemical agents, including nerve agents, psychochemicals, and hallucinogens like LSD and BZ. A total of 7,120 soldiers participated in Edgewood experiments, with 3,400 exposed to nerve agents like sarin and VX. Hundreds of experiments involved hallucinogens like LSD and BZ, with doses sometimes far exceeding those typical of recreational use. Declassified documents revealed that up to 55% of participants reported significant psychological effects, including paranoia and long-term depression. Many soldiers later described the terror of being injected with unknown chemicals, left to endure hallucinations and panic attacks without explanation. In some cases, they were told they were helping the military with protective measures, without fully understanding the risks involved. The experiments focused on how these chemicals could be used in warfare, either as incapacitating agents or as tools to manipulate the enemy's behavior. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Edgewood experiments was the testing of nerve agents like sarin and VX, which are among the deadliest chemicals ever created. These agents affect the nervous system, causing convulsions, paralysis, and in severe cases, death. Soldiers were exposed to low doses to study their effects, but even small exposures could cause significant physical and mental stress. Many participants reported long-term health effects, including chronic pain, memory loss, and psychological trauma. The Army also tested psychochemicals, substances designed to alter the mind and behavior. One of the most infamous chemicals tested was BZ, a hallucinogenic agent that could incapacitate a person for days. The idea was to create a non-lethal weapon that could render enemies incapable of fighting, but the effects on soldiers were unpredictable and sometimes devastating. Many subjects reported terrifying hallucinations, disorientation, and intense paranoia, with some psychological effects lasting long after the experiments ended. Although some soldiers volunteered for the experiments, many did not fully understand what they were signing up for. Informed consent, by modern standards, was virtually non-existent. Participants were often kept in the dark about the potential risks, and many were left to deal with the long-term consequences on their own. Decades later, veterans of the Edgewood experiments would come forward, seeking answers and justice for the harm they suffered. In 2009, a lawsuit was filed against the U.S. Department of Defense, the CIA, and other agencies on behalf of veterans who claimed they were used as human guinea pigs. The lawsuit alleged that the government had violated their constitutional rights by exposing them to dangerous chemicals without proper consent. What makes the Edgewood Arsenal experiments particularly unsettling is the sheer scope of the program and the fact that it operated in relative secrecy for so long. Thousands of soldiers were exposed to harmful substances. Yet the full extent of the program wasn't widely known until years after it had ended. Even today, much of the information remains classified, and the long-term health effects on many participants are still being debated. Veterans later described living nightmares, battling paranoia and chronic pain for years after being unwitting test subjects. For the test subjects, these weren't just experiments. They were betrayals that left scars both physical and psychological, forever altering their trust in authority. The legacy of the Edgewood experiments raises troubling questions about the role of ethics in military research. How far should a government go in the name of national security? When does the line between protecting a nation and violating individual rights become blurred? For the soldiers who unwittingly became test subjects, these questions are not just hypothetical. They are deeply personal. As we wrap up this journey through some of the creepiest government experiments, it's clear that secrecy, power, and science can be a dangerous combination. Whether through attempts to control the mind, manipulate the weather, or test the boundaries of human endurance. These experiments remind us that there is often a high cost when governments push the limits of what science can do. But the real question remains, what other experiments are still out there, hidden behind classified files and decades of silence? As we've seen through these stories, the pursuit of knowledge and security can sometimes lead to dark and unsettling places. As global conflicts evolve, shifting from Cold War rivalries to newer theaters like Syria news, Russia-Ukraine war, questions arise about whether the lessons of these clandestine programs have truly been learned. The drive to gain any strategic advantage, no matter the cost, remains toxic till the end, lingering within the shadows of modern defense strategies. These stories are more than just dark Cold War agendas. They're a stark reminder of how much can happen behind closed doors. When governments push the boundaries of science and morality, they don't just ask for your trust. They might just empty out your pockets of rights, safety, and the truth itself. While we hope lessons have been learned, the shadow of these programs still looms large. Classified files and decades of silence suggest that there may still be experiments we don't know about, hidden away from public view. As citizens, it's essential to remain vigilant, questioning how much control we give to those who wield power in secret. As we wrap up this journey through real-life horror stories that feel stranger than fiction, one question remains. When the TV off and the secrets emerge, how much do we really want to know? What would you do if you discovered these experiments were happening in your city today? The scariest secrets are the ones hiding in plain sight. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want to explore more hidden horrors and Cold War secrets. Discover the weird history of top-secret projects that shaped and scarred the world we live in today. We are Freak Files, channel that bring weird history and horror stories to life by documentary. And remember, there's always more to uncover.